of an individual's life, an idealistic part, or a part that looked to your parents as the ultimate authority figures, or a part that really did believe religiously. Or as I described, I grew up in the Cold War era where I was very much against the Nazis and against the commies, which later when I grew up, I realized that that was a lot of propaganda, and not just propaganda, but it was a lot of black and white thinking. And in particular with the Vietnam War, I came to question what we were doing there as opposed to accepting the party line of the government at the time. But my sense is that often these groups try to pair you up with more devoted followers to role model for you. They certainly use the cult leader as a role model, and they want you to read everything about him or her and be like him and her. If he only sleeps 3 or 4 hours a night, then you should only sleep 3 or 4 hours a night. If he fasted for 40 days, you should fast for 40 days. Some groups use movies to inspire people, to indoctrinate them. There's certainly a lot of cult-generated literature that's used. Sometimes there's hypnotic lectures and meditations or prayers. In my cult, my former cult, we would pray for hours at a time, and not just open-ended prayers or formal prayers, but verbal prayers. So, if I was your senior, Tom, in the Moonies, I might be, Heavenly Father, help Tom. Tom is suffering, Father. Help Tom to overcome his pride, Father. And just like going on for, I don't know, an hour or 2 hours to help guide Tom. And so...
and meanwhile, Tom is picking all this up. This is a suggestion.
Oh, yeah, Tom is praying fervently, wanting, this God's energy to flow, and to help him heal, to help him grow, to help him become a saint or a sage. And then, a lot of groups have a lot of very formal sessions of indoctrination, whether it's auditing or going up the bridge and all the courses and all the study tech. And in the Moonies, it was the 3-day workshop, the 7-day workshop, the 21-day workshop, the 40-day workshop, the 120-day workshop. And so, again, this conveyor belt of conformity. And of course, if you have any ambition at all and want to go to the top, you're going to jump higher, sleep less, work harder, recruit more people, make more money. And those people get promoted.
Okay. Destructive cults implant irrational fears as a means to influence and control their members and even non-members with views contrary to the cult. What is phobia indoctrination, and what methods do cults use for that? And I guess a question I should ask before that would be, what is a phobia?
So a phobia is an irrational fear as opposed to a rational fear. In other words, a rational fear is being afraid of something that's truly dangerous. So, for example, if you don't know how to swim, going out into the open ocean is dangerous. So you should be afraid of that. On the other hand, if you're an Olympic swimmer and you've swum the English Channel and you're afraid to go out into the ocean 100 feet out because someone gave you a hypnotic suggestion that there's going to be a shark that's going to, eat you up, that would be an example of a phobia. And basically, phobias are a mistriggering of our survival defense response to danger. So we believe we're in danger when we're not in danger. And in Releasing the Bonds in Chapter 10, I have pages of the most common phobias that I've encountered in my career of counseling folks involved with destructive cults. And they can range from, if you leave the group, you're going to get cancer, or if you leave the group, you're going to be hit by a car, or if you leave the group, you're going to go insane. and be given drugs and put in, institutionalized. Or if you leave the group, you're going to commit suicide or become a drug addict or a prostitute. In other words, in the mind of someone who has a phobia, they're incapable of visualizing being out of the group happy and fulfilled without the group. Just as someone who has a phobia of elevators can't imagine being in an elevator riding safely and comfortably. And when a member of a cult can visualize being out of the group happy and fulfilled, they're on their way out, typically, very fast. And so how do groups install phobias? Some are very overt and just say, if you leave the group, terrible things are going to happen to you. Others are more subtle and say, so-and-so who is a member of our church or a member of our family, well, I heard that he left and he just, killed himself and put himself in front of a train and died. Or, so-and-so, I heard the story that he just got committed to a mental hospital. So that could be more subtle. In my case, and going back to 1974, I know I'm dating myself, but the Exorcist movie came out, and Moon hired an entire theater in Manhattan and brought hundreds of Moonies to see The Exorcist. And then we were bussed up to hear a lecture that he gave about how God had made The Exorcist. And this movie was a prophecy of what would happen to people who left the Unification Church. And he was the Messiah in our minds. And that was a scary movie. And, to be honest, I didn't believe in Satan before meeting the Moonies. I come from a Jewish background. And after that movie, I believed in Satan. And I was out of the group for about 4 years before I started studying the whole subject of phobias. And I was like, aha, that's what that was. That was an installation of a phobia, that if I left the group, I would be possessed by evil spirits. Dang. And a light really turned on for me.
I'd like to quote from your book from chapter 10, which is called Unlocking Phobias. Occult phobia is a human-made mental illness that is an integral part of the overall mind control regime. Older rescue methods like deprogramming and exit counseling are inadequate because they attempt to persuade cult members to change their beliefs without first dealing with the phobias that paralyze them. Over to you.
Yeah, it was terrifying for me after I fell asleep at the wheel of the van and broke my leg and called my sister, and she persuaded me to come visit her, and I made her promise not to tell my parents. And at the point that my father walked in her living room and took my crutches away and announced that he had brought people to talk to me about the Moonies, I freaked. I was completely convinced that Satan had invaded, and I was just totally freaked out. And it's just not a good way to approach someone in a mind control cult. If someone had sat down and talked to me about phobias and what a phobia is and how to cure a phobia and how other groups install phobias in order to control people, and talked to me about the Jehovah's Witnesses or any number of other cults first, and asked me if I thought if people left Scientology they would go insane or be hit by a car or whatever, I'd say that's ridiculous. And then if they asked me, so do you think it's possible to leave the Unification Church and be happy and fulfilled? Then it would have made me think, because I could not believe at that moment that anyone could leave and bad things wouldn't happen. So to then be asked, would you be open to at least meeting some people who've left, who are happy and fulfilled, and decide for yourself if they're really happy and fulfilled, and see whether or not your group is just like the Jehovah's Witnesses or Scientology? That would have been a much, much better way to help me to reevaluate my involvement.
I'm going to read another passage from your book, chapter 10, called Unlocking Phobias. Members are taught that they are completely responsible for what happens to them, that there is no such thing as an accident, that everything has a spiritual cause, and that the group or leaders are almost never responsible for bad outcomes. sounds to me like the Scientology line of "you pulled it in," and you're completely responsible for everything that happens to you, sort of thing. Do you care to comment?
Yeah, it's a pattern of a dysfunctional relationship or a dysfunctional group that the leader never takes responsibility for anything that's bad. Even if they act horribly, it's always the person's fault. They made him lose his temper and smack you, or it's just not how the real world is. And so cult members are basically trained to always take responsibility. It's their responsibility if anything bad happens, and if anything good happens, it's the leader, it's the doctrine, it's the group. But anything bad that happens, it's their karma, it's their lack of faith, they haven't been committed enough, they need to try harder, they need to pay more money, they need to sleep less, eat less, whatever. So it's not fair, to say the least. Human beings are human beings, and there's no infallible leader that I've ever met, no infallible human being on earth. I know some people think Jesus was infallible, and maybe he was, but he's not around at the moment as a human being to test that. And I can certainly tell you the very spiritual people that I've met in my lifetime were incredibly humble and kind and generous and compassionate and would never blame someone else for anything. Not a chance.
I agree. I've had a very similar experience. I'm going to read some more quotes from your book here. During any cult recruitment and indoctrination, phobias of the outside world and even of the pre-cult self are methodically implanted, fertilized, and utilized. And you mention a number of methods for phobia installation in Chapter 10 of your book as well. I will mention these methods, and if you want to elaborate on them after I mention them, go ahead. Direct suggestion, indirect suggestion, the use of stories and testimonials, books, movies, and news stories, utilizing existing phobias and fears. Over to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, a direct suggestion is if you leave, you're going to be miserable and regret it forever. It's going to be worse for you than if you had never learned the truth in the first place. An indirect suggestion is something bad could happen to you. I don't know what it is, but something really bad. And I did mention before, case example, so-and-so left, and they fell apart, or they killed themselves. And I want to mention, a lot of people initially benefit when they get involved with a cult group. So maybe they were using drugs and they stopped using drugs, but the group then says, if you ever leave, you're going to not just go back to where you were before, but it's going to be 10 times worse, or it's going to be 50 times worse, or whatever. And what people need to understand is if you never got into the cult, and you wanted to get off of drugs, there would be many other opportunities and many other reputable organizations that could help you get off of drugs. And there's no need to remain indebted and enslaved because some group helped you 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And the last thing that you said was what? I wanted to comment.
Well, the use of stories and testimonials, books, movies, and news stories, and utilizing existing phobias and fears.
Oh, yeah, existing phobias. So if you had the unfortunate experience of having something really traumatic happen to you, where you have a fear of spiders or rats or snakes or whatever, before you get into a cult and you happen to tell your cult recruiter about your fear of rats or whatever, it's very easy for them to then say, well, if you leave our group, you're leaving God's church. And it would be like being trapped in a room full of rats for eternity, or a room full of spiders for eternity. And so if someone's already freaked out about one spider and somebody's telling you, leave the group and you'll be stuck with thousands of spiders forever and ever, it's going to keep you in there for a pretty long time.
And using movies, stories, and testimonials, things
well,
like
I mentioned The Exorcist as one example. I mean, Jaws put more phobias in people's minds about the ocean and about sharks the overwhelming reality is more people die of bee stings than shark bites, and unfortunately, we've killed off the sharks of the world so that they're in many cases endangered species. And I love to scuba dive, and I